Hello, and welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
And we want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week.
Surprise, surprise.
What are you bringing to the table today? I hope it wasn't a surprise to you. As we said last week, this is how it goes, back and forth.
Woefully unprepared this time.
Oh, no.
No, I have brought a piece from In These Times magazine to the table for us today, as I said last week, so not that much of a surprise. The piece is called The Crackdown on Campus Protests is Just Beginning. It was written by Adam Federman and published just last month. If folks want to head over to In These Times and check it out with us. Adam Federman has written a few pieces for In These Times, but he's also a reporting fellow with Type Investigations, and his work has been featured in Politico, The Washington Post, Wired, among a few others. This was a really great piece that we got to read for today. It was an analysis of how institutions across the country have changed their policies on demonstrations in reaction to student protests on their campuses that have been calling for divestment from doing business with Israel and pushing for and fighting for justice and peace in Palestine. And the impact that these demonstrations and the policy changes in particular have had and will continue to have on higher education and the higher education landscape moving forward. And one of the things I'll briefly just mention is how broad this piece is in terms of its coverage. Mm-hmm. I mean, the amount of institutions mentioned is pretty wild. We're talking Indiana University, Columbia, Brown, UC Berkeley, NYU, UPenn, University of Michigan, UVA, American University, Cornell, Harvard, Franklin and Marshall, Lehigh, Caltech, Barnard, UT Austin, Washington University in St. Louis, Dartmouth, University of Chicago, UCLA, and Princeton. I think I got them all. Oh, yeah, seriously, because all of those are mentioned for not great reasons on the whole.
Yeah.
So there's a lot, I think, of potential case study here and lots to learn from what's been going on for the past several months, really. Mm-hmm. And I know I mentioned this last week, but I was super excited to find and bring this piece to the table because we both have a vested interest in how social justice shows up on college campuses. Mm-hmm. So I thought this would be a really great piece for us to talk about here at the table for that reason, but obviously just to continue to talk about and learn from what's been going on around the country at all of these institutions. So yeah, let's get into it. What did you think of it? Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I thought this was a nice summary of the ways that campus policies have shifted in response to the protests against Israel's genocide in Gaza and the occupation of Palestine more broadly. There's a lot in here that I think is interesting to me and you too, I would guess.
Yes.
I would hazard to guess.
You know me.
Also are interested in it. But particularly about how administrations across many college campuses have chosen to respond to these encampments.
Yes.
Particularly the few examples where there is evidence that the institutions made these changes in response to the anti-genocide protests, which goes against decades of Supreme Court precedent and practice in higher education of content neutrality, which is about being neutral on the content of speech unless there are direct threats of violence or shouting fire in a movie theater kind of stuff. Because of this precedent and this practice, we've had decades of right-wing people speaking on campuses across the country with protest and backlash from student organizers, but otherwise there's usually little to no reaction from the college campuses themselves, except maybe a statement about how the speech of this person is deplorable, but they have a right to say it, and so we're going to pay campus police and security extra money to make sure that it's safe, and thereby spending more money to protect people who are saying things that you consider deplorable. Here we are. And maybe there will be some dialogue space offered to process what's happening and the reaction to it, again, by taxing the people who work in those kinds of offices with doing that labor, even though they didn't really choose to do that. Here we go. But now we have student encampments and protests against an active genocide perpetuated by Israel against the occupied people in Gaza. And these pop up across the country as one manifestation of movement against this genocide and occupation. And all of a sudden, we have institutions jumping at the chance to crack down on speech because it's speech that they don't like. And it's just, remarkable that all of the stuff that I learned about in higher ed law as I was getting my master's degree just thrown out the window.
Seriously.
With these protests and the crackdown on these protests.
Yeah, that's quite the juxtaposition you present there. That has been the party line for college campuses for years. And now all of a sudden, when college students and staff and faculty too, when folks on these campuses are talking about Israel and talking about Palestine, now we've got a problem across the board, and in so many places, not everywhere, but across the board. So yeah, that juxtaposition is wild to me. One of the other things that stood out to me in this piece that it also boggles my mind when I think about, what's happening on college campuses, and more importantly, I think what should be happening, and what learning labs like college campuses should enable and foster. It is what's happening as it relates to this idea that this piece names as, quote unquote, the Palestine exception. And so this kind of gets into what you were talking about too. So I pulled this quote. Adam Federman says this: as colleges and universities have become the focal point of Gaza protests, at least a dozen have overhauled campus conduct rules in ways that will effectively limit speech and make it riskier to protest. And this marks an abrupt change from the direction academia has been moving in. Over the past decade, universities, including Indiana, had become more lenient in allowing protests and encampments to stand without resorting to the kind of force we've seen recently, in a vivid example of what some call the Palestine exception. So to me, like, this idea that institutions are changing long-standing policy, like you mentioned, are in this case around demonstrations, without input from their students, their faculty, their staff at large, because in some cases the folks making the decision are staff, but it's the upper echelon of the university administration. And that the consequence of that has led to the use of police force, right, to combat it at so many of these institutions is so concerning and heartbreaking and 100% troubling. And especially as someone who believes in this idea that colleges and universities should be learning labs, like I mentioned, like these are places and spaces where students can apply their learning that they're engaged in both inside and outside of the classroom to real world situations, like, gestures in the air, genocide of Palestinian people, and a continued investment in the perpetrators of that genocide. Like, we want students to learn what's happening in the world and to figure out real world solutions to those problems. And we have that, and there's this backlash. I think there's something so fundamentally wrong about that, right?
Yeah, and I mean, institutions have a vested interest in that. So you talked about police activity, and this article opens with a story from Indiana University in Bloomington, which I think is a very specific case study. I would say great, but it's not
right.
It's not great
in that sense, right?
It's illuminating,
about
how institutions have been reacting. So IU rewrote a policy the night before an encampment was set to begin, which prohibited tents without prior approval. This policy had been, not as strict. In fact, students had gathered there several times over the last 50 to 60 years. Right. There were protests against apartheid in the 80s in South Africa and against the Gulf War in the 90s. But with this change in policy, the encampment was no longer permitted.
Right.
And instead permitted in multiple ways, multiple meanings, because they didn't have a permit. They weren't permitted.
Hey, wow.
Sorry. Yeah. Little joke there.
There it is.
Buried in the words. So instead of figuring out a way to hold students accountable to a policy within the institutional procedure, which the students didn't know was a policy because they changed it overnight, the state police are called in with snipers installed on roofs of nearby buildings. So we have a spineless autocratic committee who have been appointed at the last minute to respond to anticipated speech from students. And they change the policies about tents on campus, which they then enforce with state police and snipers.
Yeah.
What a country we live in.
Oh my gosh, yes.
It's almost like it's a country where the Supreme Court decides that the chief executive of the country could do whatever it wants.
Absolutely.
As long as it's within the confines of their job, which
sounds familiar.
is almost anything.
Yeah.
That's another episode, maybe sometime. Yeah, this is acceptable though, apparently, right?
Apparently
and
so.
it really rips to shred any kind of propaganda that we've been fed by school and the media and politicians about our freedoms, specifically our freedom of speech. And it's a gross double standard that students who speak up about people being held in an open air cage and bombed incessantly are met with police snipers, while white supremacists with tiki torches can march through a college campus shouting their racist slogans without fear of arrest or any kind of confrontation from law enforcement at all.
Wow. Yes, absolutely. Well, what really gets me about that case study, if you will, is also the timeline of it. And so they changed that policy overnight in response to the encampment that they know was happening the next day. And it sounds like they let the faculty know soon-ish after the policy was made, but then the students didn't know for full 24 hours. So you're right. They were met with snipers on the roof. That was the response. It wasn't the university president coming out or the dean of students or whoever, poor soul that has to be to come out and say, hey, we've actually changed the policy. Or, let's put this into effect the day after. So we have time to tell our students and inform our campus of this major policy change. Like there were so many other options, I think, but instead of just changing the policy in the darkness of night and calling the police at 8 a.m. The other thing that really gets me is I just don't ever want to see snipers on the roof of our college camp on any buildings in our college campuses. Like, no, yeah,
it's outlandish, and that really harkens back to me of Kent State.
Yes.
And the way that all happened. And it's remarkable that institutions of higher learning didn't learn anything.
From that.
About it.
Yeah. We have been here before. As much as we talk about history, we have been here before.
Yeah.
The other sort of part of incredible analysis in this piece, I think, that I wanted to talk about is the broader context and implication of what we're seeing on college campuses. So the crackdown on demonstrations for divestment and against the genocide of Palestinians is troubling in and of itself. But when you step back and look at it in the context of the larger effort by the state to crack down on social movements at large and in general, that's significant. And that's a huge problem. So I pulled this quote from Adam Federman. He says, quote, all of this is part of a broader legislative push at the state and federal levels to undermine social movements, from the anti-pipeline campaigns of the 2010s to Black Lives Matter and Stop Cop City, by enhancing penalties for common protest-related crimes such as trespassing or blocking traffic. Several states have cited recent protests against U.S. policy on Israel as their motivation for creating stiffer punishments for blocking traffic. In its most extreme form, New York Democrats in the last legislative session put forward a bill that would make blocking a highway or bridge an act of domestic terrorism. Trump, for his part, has reportedly said that if he's reelected, he will deport student protesters and set that movement back 25 or 30 years. And there's so much in that. Some of the examples shared in this piece include the proposed Columbia Act in New York that would implement, they called them, quote, anti-Semitism monitors on college campuses. And then there's the example of Governor Abbott in Texas directing all college campuses to update their free speech policies as it relates directly to anti-Semitism. And, but there's so much in this about like domestic terrorism and that this notion of like blocking traffic and whatnot. And we've talked about, civil disobedience and making good trouble and all of that there's so much in this that like is so concerning. But all of this is, just example after example of how difficult this work is and how dangerous this work is to fight against injustice, to fight against the state in all of its forms, all of its tentacles, whether that's the federal government, that's a state government, and I guess now even a college institution, right?
Yeah, and all of this is insidious and it's terrible. And I also would be willing to bet that most of the administrators that are at these institutions making these decisions will be philosophically opposed to the laws that you mentioned that are popping up across the country.
Yes.
At least that's what they would say, maybe to your face.
Yes.
But
alas,
here they are doing the same thing on their campuses. And, I want to point out a couple things that he mentioned about these laws, some of which include further punishments for students who get arrested at a protest by revoking their student visa or their financial aid. And that brings me back to the argument about how debt is used as a tool of control for students, and higher education funding was cut specifically as a response to student unrest in the 60s and 70s against Vietnam and for the civil rights movement.
Right. So,
with the cuts to higher education, it's no wonder that the institutions didn't learn anything about themselves. So, in addition to that policy backlash in cutting funding, there's been a cultural shift in what the purpose of education is for.
Yes.
And we don't see education as a value anymore unless it's in the service of getting someone a job so they can be a, quote, productive member of society. And a productive member in the normative way of getting a job, preferably in science, technology, engineering, and or math, so that they can continue to grow the economy, which typically means the military-industrial complex.
Wow.
And you can't get, we talked about a vested interest, you can't get sponsorships at your institution, at your university, by encouraging students to go into philosophy or creating art. So Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and Google have a vested interest in all of us being ignorant of the humanities, because then it's easier for us to turn the other way when they're supporting an apartheid regime that's committing genocide.
Yes.
So that's the vested interest that we talked about earlier, is that, that's it.
Yeah.
That's the connection. That's the through line.
Absolutely. Right.
And
it's
borrowing a little bit from my application.
There you go. A little preview. But what you also do there is you connect again to this idea of we haven't learned from our history. These institutions haven't learned from their own history in that way. So, yeah. All right. Well, you mentioned application. I feel like with so many of our conversations where the media itself is so great, the whole episode is some form of application, but let's formally shift into and talk about that. So how does this piece and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and work? What worries me about all of this is something that Adam says in this piece about what we should or could expect to see in the future. So he says, quote, "As a result, colleges are coming to look more like a police state than institutions of higher learning. And this is just the beginning. With students leaving for the summer and most encampments removed, at least for now, university administrators have the chance to overhaul campus policies and implement newly repressive measures in the fall." And that worries me. I'm worried about how many more institutions will ban student chapters of organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine or Jewish Voice for Peace. I'm worried about how many more policies will be enacted on college campuses that limit free speech and First Amendment protected activity during the summer when students aren't here without their input. I'm worried about how many more institutions will call in law enforcement to respond to demonstrations and inflict violence upon their campus communities, because even the mere calling of law enforcement and their presence on campus is violence. And so I guess for me, my application is that I'm just worried about what might be coming and trying to figure out, and I'm sure you and I will continue to have lots of conversations about this, like what is within our power to do about this, to try and make sure that it doesn't continue to happen. It certainly doesn't happen on hopefully our campus where we work, but on the whole, right? Like what can we do to make it clear that this is not something that we want to see at our institutions of higher learning?
Yeah. It's troubling. And I think, it makes me think a lot about the way that the police state has expanded its reach over the course of the last several decades too, in tandem with the way that we've had a neoliberal economic turn, which led to, as I mentioned earlier, the defunding of education over the last several decades. Those things have gone hand in hand, and you've seen the money shift from education into like enforcement policies and policing. But what this ultimately did was put a for sale sign up in the windows of our public institutions. So huge corporations saw the opportunity to come in and provide sorely needed funds while getting themselves a tax break.
Yes.
And this means that corporations' vested interests become the institution's vested interest. And cracking down on speech that demands that institutions divest from war is bad for business, for the companies that have purchased little corners of these public institutions.
Yes. Wow. That you did preview that very nicely. Oh, well done. Yeah, it's troubling to see that happen. And, anytime an institution enters into an agreement with a corporation, there's lots of good that often comes from that. New buildings, scholarships, aid, programming, staffing, but there's also a lot of bad often, especially when these companies are, you mentioned Lockheed and others, these companies that have aided in the genocide, right? Yeah. And we've read about that and we've talked about that before. So yeah, that's some good application there. All right, well, let's talk about homework. What do we want to do after reading this piece and having this conversation to continue our learning? In These Times magazine actually has quite a few pieces on Israel and Palestine that I'd like to check out.
Yeah.
And they've got a full-on part of their website about it and lots of articles there. So I want to check that out. There was even another piece on the same topic as the one we read for today, and I almost brought that one to the table. So that one's called Students, Gaza, and a New Vision of Safety by Sarah Jaffe. And so I definitely want to read that for homework as well. I also know that In These Times recently released their June issue. So that's certainly on my list to check out and see what else we could bring to the table from them. What about you?
Yeah. My homework is to read an article that's mentioned in this article and is published in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Yes. The article is called The Chicago Principles Are Undemocratic, and it's written by Anton Ford, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago. So these are principles that have been offered by the University of Chicago and adopted by 90 institutions. So they're fairly widespread, and there seem to be some pretty problematic elements to them. It's about speech and politics and those kind of things, and the ways that institutions create policies around what's allowed and what's permitted and what's not, and how to navigate those things as an institution, I believe.
Yes,
so,
that sounds fascinating. I would love to read that too.
Yeah.
Very good. All right, well, I feel like this is a good place for us to stop. Thanks for listening to us talk about this really important topic. And, we'll continue to watch what happens over the summer, how this unfolds. And, when institutions start back up with the true academic year in August, we'll see what's to come.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I guess so.
Yeah. All right, my friend, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm bringing a documentary called Berry Farm, which you can watch on the Canopy streaming service with your local library card.
Yes.
It is about an area of Washington, D.C. known as Berry Farm, which was a big public housing development and has a long history before that as well. But this has recently been torn down and is in the process of being redeveloped. Part of the description from the film says, quote, "Over centuries, Berry Farm emerged as an historic African-American community in the nation's capital. Today, the neighborhood faces tremendous pressures of redevelopment. This film tells a story of Berry Farm, but in the cycles of place and displacement, it is a story of the United States." And I'm almost finished with it. It's really powerful. There's a lot of interviews of people who are or were residents of Berry Farm, and there's also the history of how Berry Farm sort of came to be and what it was before it was Berry Farm, and all these kind of things. So it's very, very interesting piece of local history for us that I'm excited to talk more about as we think more about displacement and gentrification and the different ways that displacement pops up in the world in capitalist economies.
Yeah, well, and a big part of our backyard here too. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm excited about this one. I had not heard of this film before, but any opportunity to watch a film and to support our friends over at Canopy, I feel like we've picked a lot of things from their streaming service. Yeah, I'm excited to learn more about our history right down the street. So cool. Looking forward to it. All right, well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on the socials, including Instagram and TikTok, check us out on YouTube, and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.